Hey, Dickheads! Like a pink laser beam of truth beaming from the cyberpunk capital of the universe to your brain hole. I am your host, David Agronoff, but I will be joined by the entire Philip K. Dick universe as much as we can fit it onto an internet stream to talk with Cyberpunk Patient Zero himself, the legend, John Shirley, is here to talk with us about his career. I've got a stack of John Shirley books here that I think are Dickian that I want to talk about, but we'll also just get into what it was like to be a young science fiction writer in the 70s at the same time when Phil was active. That's one of the things that I would like to talk to John about. John was on this podcast before on our Scanner Darkly episode, and that is one of my favorite episodes of the podcast. So, and John, his feedback on that novel was incredible. So, if you have not listened to the Scanner Darkly episode, I highly recommend you do that. Before we get into the conversation, really quick, let me just tell you who's coming up the rest of this month. I have 3 of the 4 slots for April already booked. Next week, we'll be talking to James Reich about Skinship, which was what my #1 read of the year last year. And some of you will remember James from the Philip K. Dick Festival. He was with us hanging out. And so we'll be talking about that one, which came out from Anti-Oedipus Press. My co-host on the podcast, D. Harlan Wilson's publishing company. And the week after that, April 15th, we'll have Robin Murphy, who is the author of Robotics Through Science Fiction. She's a professor of robotics at Texas A&M University, and she is one of the foremost experts of the depiction of robotics in science fiction, but she's also wrote a book about using robotics for disaster relief, and she's actually designed robots to be used in disaster relief, and she's really incredible, and she knows her PKD, and so she's very excited to talk to us about artificial people and Philip K. Dick. So that one should be really exciting. And then either the 22nd or the 29th, we're working that out. Cody Goodfellow will be on to talk about his next book, New Tomorrow, and that's it for April. So please keep your eye out for these live talks, and please join us. But tonight, John Shirley. John is the screenwriter or co-screenwriter of The Crow, the original, not the crappy one that came out last year. He is the author of the second most amount of books on my personal shelf, behind Philip K. Dick. Well, maybe John, I might have more of yours, to be honest with you. His science fiction masterpieces include books like The Angel with Television Eyes, City Come A-Walking, and A Splendid Chaos. It was William Gibson who called him personally Cyberpunk Patient Zero when talking about his 1978 science fiction masterpiece, City Come A-Walking.
Hey, Eggs.
Yes.
Your microphone's coming through a little like through a Scanner Darkly a little bit. If you could jiggle, are there any chords that you need to jiggle or anything? Because occasionally you sound a lot louder.
How's it sound now?
That's better, I think.
Whoa. Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe I was a little close to the microphone, so
it's like a grounding problem.
It's user error. Well, hopefully I won't have to do as much talking tonight. But John is joining us from his home in Vancouver, Washington. And John, welcome to the PKD Hangout. We're really excited to have you here.
Yeah, it's good to be here. Good to see everyone.
Yeah, I'm sorry we're doing this at a time when the world is so awful, but it's not that you didn't warn us, John.
Well, also it's kind of appropriate too.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, Dick wrote dystopian fiction much of the time, maybe all the time. I don't know, but a lot of it, and we people from my corner of science fiction sort of specialized in it. And here we are feeling right at home. And in the electronic autocracy developing.
That's right. So can you give us a little brief introduction about how you got into science fiction? And you're not only just a pioneer in science fiction and cyberpunk, but also punk rock in general. So maybe tell the folks about where you grew up and how you got kind of started in all this stuff.
Oh, I grew up all over the place. I probably in the Willamette Valley in Oregon more than any other place. My parents moved around a fair amount, but we moved to Nevada at one point where my father died from meningitis, and I was only 10. And then we were in Mississippi for a while because I had a relative there, and we ended up back in Oregon, and we made it our home, and finally, and I eventually got into both the science fiction scene and the punk rock scene in Portland, Oregon.
Well, it was your sister's
there was a kind of a science. There was a magazine called The Stranger. It's different than the one they have now, in Portland, and it was run by Mike Zaharakis, kind of a legendary figure who's since died. And it was all about kind of, freedom of social freedom and political protest, because it was the Nixon era and it was the Vietnam War time. And also science fiction, though, kept coming into it all the time because he was a fan. And so, I kind of found my people there.
Well, it was also your sister had science fiction magazines.
My sister had boxes of them, and I found them and got into them, Galaxy especially. And by already I had been reading Edgar Rice Burroughs as a child, and I loved the Mars books and those things, and early Robert Heinlein books as a child. His juvenile books and all of that. I mean, I think when I was like 8 years old, I read Tom, what's his name? Space Cadet.
Corbett.
Tom Corbett, Space Cadet. Yeah, I knew it had an alliteration. And so, I mean, I was very grounded in it. And when I was a little kid, I had some serious trauma happen to me, and this twisted me in a way I won't go into here. Had to do with neighbors in our area, and in kind of escaping from the reality that came after that, I got more and more into the universe of science fiction, the universes of science fiction and fantasy and escapism into those things. And I haunted the library, taking out everything about them and reading my sister's magazines. And I eventually found fanzines, and I would write to the fanzines and just utterly perplexing them because I was saying lunatic things even then. And they said things like, "Is John Shirley a hoax? I think he's a fanzine hoax. I want to know who this really is." And that was my early introduction to the fandom scene. And then there was the things happened like the My Lai massacre, which was the murder of an entire village of Vietnamese people by American troops, and photographs of it, bloody, crisp, clear photos of little babies shot to pieces, and men, women, children, the whole village massacred by American troops, published in Life magazine. And that kind of changed my life. I had a sudden perspective about the nature of kind of the crypto part of our society, the hidden part. And it had accidentally been allowed in Life magazine. It shook a lot of people up, and it so it was a kind of radicalization for me, and that took me to The Stranger, and then also the fandom world around it, and then later on in Portland, along came punk rock, and I loved rock and roll already. I was very big into the Mothers of Invention and Alice Cooper and early Rolling Stones and all that stuff, the Animals, and part of me wanted to be on stage. It was always a performer, and so punk rock was like a quick way to break into being on stage, which was barely more than playing in your garage. I mean, but you would just set up stages somewhere and 8 people would show up, and then you'd play for them, and then those 8 people would come up and they would play for you, and that was the punk rock scene originally. But it was empowering, weirdos and misfits like me. So that kind of whole concept of like there's an alternate art for people on the street and people who are don't relate, like they don't identify with the major society, with mainstream society.
Now, John,
that was a very liberating thing. So, and it all came together, and my science fiction explored a lot of those kinds of images and feelings.
So your generation was really kind of forged your own path with cyberpunk, but how do you have any memories of where you kind of first realized that the new wave of science fiction existed, that there were new kinds of political voices? I know there's a little bit of that in Galaxy, slipping past Forest Gold, but
I'm going to say I first really got to understand and to see that stuff when I went to the Clarion Writers Workshop when I was 19 years old. It was in Seattle, and the people there were like Ursula Le Guin was there, and she knew all about that scene. And Harlan Ellison was there, and he was part of it. His Dangerous Visions thing was related to the new wave of science fiction. So Harlan was there, and Frank Herbert was there, who was kind of on more the right wing side of science fiction, but a great intellect. Was there, and he did tell me that he had taken psychedelic mushrooms, and by this time I had taken acid and so on too, which had a big effect on me. I wasn't taking it, in handfuls all the time, but every so often I took a trip and had bad ones and good ones, and all of that did affect me. I never wrote stoned on anything in my life, but it affected my writing because it gave me. It broke up like any kind of stodginess of my perspective. Anything that was like too molded, it would cracked it open. So,
well, and that's something you share with.
And people like Michael Moorcock also wrote on under the influence of acid. It was very apparent in a lot of his Jerry Cornelius stories. People like Robert Sheckley too did. He did a lot of acid, and I think and Brian Aldiss famously, Barefoot in the Head, right? And he was very into it, and it had a big effect on liberating his point of view on things and opening up new avenues of conjecture. So all of those things converged around then, the influence of psychedelics, and so the underground reaction to things like the My Lai massacre, and bombing of Laos and Cambodia, and the suppression of protest that was happening then, the Kent State Massacre. People were affected by these things, and that all sort of merged into new wave science fiction for me. And when I read it, there was it had its It's you know, it was a lot of it was focused in the famous magazine.
Well, one thing you share with our guy Phil is that I believe one of your masterpieces, or probably my favorite of your novels, is Wet Bones, which is your sort of anti-drug novel that was essentially written when you were
anti-addictive drugs.
Anti-addictive drugs, and when you were fighting the addiction yourself at the time.
By that time, I'd become a cocaine addict, and I didn't write on cocaine either. By the way, only did cocaine in binges, and mostly I injected it, but it was really fucking me up.
And the novel, of course, I'm speaking of is Wet Bones,
Badly.
which is more of a horror novel than some of your science fiction work. But that's one of the reasons why I called on you for the Scanner Darkly episode. But
the Scanner Darkly has a lot I related to.
Yeah.
Lot I related to. The people struggling with a drug that they don't really understand where it's from exactly. You know, you get these street drugs, and some of them were, you know, experimented. I mean, famously, the CIA's program experimented with giving people acid and not telling them what it was. I mean, long before it was like a staple on the street. MK Ultra experiments, and I'll tell you a story. One time I was a teenager, 15 or 16, maybe 16, and I was walking down a railroad track, and there was a guy walking toward me, and he didn't look like a guy who should be on a railroad track. He looked like a guy who should be golfing or something. He looked like this kind of early middle-aged guy in nice clothing, nice haircut, and I just felt like he was in disguise. But he started talking to me, and I was this long-haired kid, you know, and he said, "Have you heard about the drug STP?" And I said, "No." You know, and I was actually actively looking for drugs that day, and and I think he could see that or something. I don't know. It came out somehow, and he gave me some. He said, "Hey, this is that drug, man. It's just going to be an incredible trip for you. I'm just handing out to people who want to try this out." And he asked me my full name, which seemed strange to me. And then and then he sent me on my way. I took the drug, and it was extremely brutal. It was a psychedelic drug, but in a nightmarish way. It was, in fact, very quickly it induced psychosis. And by the time I got home, I was tearing off my clothes and running around the house, smashing windows. And the whole story is very grim. My mother was terrified, but soon the police were there, and they took me out in doubly handcuffs. My legs and wrists were handcuffed. And I was taken to the state hospital in Salem, Oregon, which was the exact same ward used to inspire One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Ken Kesey had worked at the same ward earlier. And I didn't see Big Nurse, but it was the same ward that he had worked at. I learned later. And I was there for like a week, and they were giving us Thorazine. I could just tell you horror stories, but it would take up too much of the interview. But it was a terrible nightmare. In fact, I have an article coming out in a revised, relaunched fanzine called Boonfark from Dan Steffen. And it's in this magazine. Is a one-shot homage to the old fanzines, kind of nicely printed, but still amateurishly put together in some ways, with a lot of fan art and so on. And people like Ted White and other science fiction writers from that era will be in it, in Boonfark. And so I have an article in it that that tells about my relationship with Harlan Ellison and why it went bad. And in order to explain that, I had to talk about my early traumas, and then things like the STP experience and other nightmarish things that happened to me. One when I was hitchhiking, and I don't even want to talk about it right now, but I put it in the article. So look for that. It'll be out in a month or two if you want the details of that stuff.
Right. I think
even then,
I shared part of that with a smaller group of the Hangout a while back when you sent it to me, and it's a great article. I highly recommend it.
But see, the point I was trying to make is that the STP experience was like the Philip Dick book, in that as you get into the novel, more and more you discover that the drug is basically a kind of a social control tool, and experiment, and they're experimenting on people, and it was, and I think what I experienced was one such thing in real life.
Well,
and it was I had that in common with the fictional characters of Scanner Darkly, and also the culture that Dick knew about from, like he had roomies and people around him who were doing drugs, and he was doing speed, and some other things occasionally. That the kind of culture that was around a place like that, where people getting high and their brains are racing, really, really fast moving, and they're all in the same environment that you find in A Scanner Darkly. I had a number of experiences like that, and so I immediately embraced the book partly on that basis alone. I'd already been into his A Maze of Death and certain other Martian Time Slip. These things were important to me too.
Do you remember which one you read first or discovered?
I read A Maze of Death first because I liked the title. So
yeah,
I didn't know much about him at the time, but also Ursula Le Guin had told me about him. I hadn't read much of him then, and she told me about some of the other things he'd done by then. And I said, I haven't read that. And she even told me that that she was writing a novel that was heavily influenced by him.
Lamp of Heaven.
And it was The Lathe of Heaven.
Lamp of Heaven, yeah. That's amazing that you, class of 47 from Berkeley, Ursula Le Guin was the one telling you about PKD. That's quite a...
Oh, she was a big fan of Dick's at the time. Later on, she kind of went off him because he was getting more and more paranoid. But so she sort of cut him off. And and also, who else was there? Robert Silverberg was there, for example. And Silverberg had his own psychedelic experiences, by the way.
Yeah. And I want to get back into those guys, but I want to talk a little bit about your work before I open up the floor.
By all means.
I want to talk about some of the books that I think are a little bit Dickian. One of the ones that I think is very Dickian is the Angel with Television Eyes. This book is about the main character is kind of a Kevin Sorbo type failed Hollywood fantasy actor who kind of has his eyes open to this like world of beings that live on a subatomic level that are kind of having a hard time with all the electromagnetic energy in the air. What was the inspiration for The Angel with Television Eyes?
Speculation. My feeling that there are invisible beings around us, but not like ghosts or something. They're just they're naturally emergent. They emerge from the natural world. They're just subtle bodied, and then I had also read a lot of wild speculation about the possibilities of quantum mechanics. Even then, it was around, and subatomic physics. various books.
Yeah, this one's a little hard to find, but I think it's one of the.
Well, it's not if it really, because you can get it. I believe you can get it as a physical book, as a print on demand. But it's Start Media has it. You can get it as an ebook instantaneously, and The Angel with Television Eyes, and it is an audiobook. Have you heard that?
I have not heard that, but
well, neither have I. But it is one, and I've heard that. I've never listened to an audio. There are like 12 of my books that are audiobooks, and I've never listened to one through. But not that they were done terribly. I just, I would just sit and think. I would just sit and think, why didn't I make that sentence ring more powerfully? I would just criticize it in my mind. Even
well, part of the audiobook of Demons was read by Harlan Ellison. So
yes, Demons was a strange case. It was a strange case. I think I was the first reader, and then Harlan came in to do some because he really liked the book, and because I was unable to stay in Los Angeles because of some stuff going on. I had to go somewhere having to do with my family. So he stepped in, and then he had to do some other stuff. And then this woman reader steps in toward the end of Demons. But it's an unusual audiobook with 3 readers. But I'm told it all came out well.
Demons was, by the way, the first John Shirley book I ever read. So that was the one I discovered you from. City Come a Walkin' from 1978. This is the one that William Gibson called Cyberpunk Patient Zero. And one of the things is that you have the city developing a personality based on kind of the sleeping and the TV watching unconscious of the people in the city. At least, it's been 10 years since I read it, so I hope I'm
no, it's the collective unconscious. I was just taking this idea from Jung and taking it to places he would not have approved of. With the collective unconscious becoming discrete, separate in itself, having its own fullness and gelling, you might say, into an entity itself for particular cities. So there would be a collective unconscious of New York and San Francisco and so on. And there is some idea in a Fritz Leiber novel that's similar, I'm told, but I haven't read the book. Is it Our Lady of Darkness?
Well, and M.K. Jemisin recently did a book called The City We Become, where the different neighborhoods of New York developed their own kind of angry personalities.
Well, that's interesting. That's kind of a cool variant, and we'll pretend that he didn't borrow the basic idea from me, but that's okay. But and anyway, Fritz Leiber praised the book very much. He wrote it in a fantasy zine about it and really liked it, and so I felt vindicated by that. But I will tell you also that as far as cyberpunk, my novel, my novel Transmaniacon and my story collection Heatseeker, my first story collection, were both very influential for it also. And in fact, Bruce Sterling says Heatseeker is one of the big influences of cyberpunk. It's not really in print right now.
Well, speaking of Transmaniacon, and I'm a firm believer in the original 1978 version that has the Soviet Union and everything involved in it, because
it still does, I think.
Yeah, because I think it speaks to where your brain was at the time. I think Transmaniacon is proto-bizarro and one of the weirdest books that you have written. For one thing, it has like fly and owl cars, dolphin pilots who lead blood cults.
The dolphins actual dolphins would get into a little sort of cylinder which they could operate with their minds and filled with water up to a point, and then and also oxygen for them for the blowhole. And they would ride around in this thing and have extenders from kind of a little bit Dalek-like, but they were benevolent creatures and trying to get things done. And they were at this whole subculture themselves of dolphins rolling down the street in their little cylinders.
And there's
upright,
giant
like
flesh tractor hands. That this is a very weird book, and I love the shit out of it. And
my idea was I was inspired by Federico Fellini writing that book. I wanted to do a science fiction Fellini. It was somewhat like Satyricon to me, which several of his movies were really influential on me, and I'm really influenced by underground movies of different kinds.
Now, one of the ones that I suggested to the people who join this all the time is a very Phil Dickian novel, is A Splendid Chaos, which, by the way, you were blurbed by, this novel got blurbed by China Mieville, which is a pretty big get.
China Mieville, yeah.
Because
he read it and he told me it influenced him. And it's one of the few books of mine that came out as an edition in England. And so he picked it up at the newsstand or whatever.
Zero, who's a musician that gets kidnapped off of Earth, and he's stuck in a world called Fool's Hope. And there's 31 other...
a world called False Hope, that's right.
31 other races that got to get pulled into the same situation. And then there's this kind of swirling chaos that comes from there. What was behind this book?
Well, paranoia, I think. I mean, not that I'm really a, diagnosable paranoid. I've always said, what my expression is, paranoia is a skill.
Right.
And so, writers use it as a skill, going back to Poe and people like that. And so I have often thought I'm one of those people who worries about the possibility of some race, not necessarily extraterrestrial, but perhaps invisible, or I won't go into the whole metaphysical theory of it, but it would just take too long. But that is kind of using us as like an ant farm or something. It's one of those ideas. And so in this case, at the time, there were a lot of claims of alien abduction. And I thought, well, what would it be like if you were abducted and you were put on another planet and you were in a sort of, you've discovered you were in the whole planet was a kind of experimental laboratory. And that's really what was going on in the book. But the people kind of do struggle to find a transcendence in it. And there's some psychedelic drugs, some based on, I think, peyote, in my mind, that are extant on the planet and that influences how things come out. There's, and you do get a sense of transcendence and people transcending their trappedness, which is a big theme of mine. I was influenced by the transcendentalists too, Thoreau and people like that.
And then the last one that I'm going to bring up is The Black Hole of Carcosa. Now this is a very weird book. Now I looked, and my review of this on Goodreads was 15 years ago. So I read it 15 years ago, which is, so my memory of it's a little vague. But this is a Subgenius novel, is it correct?
It is Church of the Subgenius. It was. I'm the Grand High Inquisitor of the Church of the Subgenius, and when the Exes come from the Sin Galaxy, and to take, faithful subgeniuses to the planet of bliss, and escaping from the conspiracy that holds us here. I will be the one who will be interrogating people, and basically a kind of Torquemada who will use unspeakable devices to find out if you deserve to go on the flying saucers to the bliss realm, and those who don't go are just, they'll be destroyed by the Exes. At any rate, that is subgenius mythology, which they decided to make up their own religion because any idiot can do that. Apparently, Joseph Smith made up his, and L. Ron Hubbard made up his, and they work. So, but the subgenius one is more satirical and comedic and arty, and so I was part of that. So I took tropes from it and worked them into the book. Things, and you can find all that stuff woven through it, and it's theoretically about a private eye on another planet finding things out, but it is kind of comedic, and it has things in it like there are fairies that are troubling people, like just like little Tinkerbell type fairies, and they're really annoying, and so there are people using a kind of fairy DDT spray on them, and and cheerfully exterminating all these little fairies. And so I used it as I was tired of like really twee and cute stuff, and so I used the book to kind of ridicule all kinds of things I wanted to ridicule.
Very funny, very bizarro book. I quite
enjoyed it. It was bizarro.
Before the term existed.
You shouldn't ask me about these things, because then I'll go on and on into it, and then and I'll actually tell you about them. And the thing is, none of them are simple. I've been simplifying.
Yeah, well, that's okay. We but I'm going to open up the floor a little bit here now too, and we'll continue to talk about what was going on in the 70s. If anyone wants to ask a question, you can go down to the reaction section of Zoom and do a hand raise at any point, and then we'll get to those questions. But in the meantime, I do want to talk about how you feel like, it's those of us who are younger, who weren't around in the 70s. We try to make sense of what Phil was doing business-wise in the 70s a lot of times. And I'm wondering, because this was your first decade working as a writer, what do you think the biggest difference is between being a science fiction writer in that era versus today, that immediately come to your mind, John?
Well, although there was a lot of formulaic writing, and in fact, Ellison and the new wave of science fiction people and the New World writers were reacting to that and pushing back against it. And a lot was done there. Nevertheless, commercially, the science fiction formulas usually triumphed. But still, because it was like post this 1960s, a time of wild experimentation in society, even for people who hadn't gotten stoned, they were still affected by the idea of free love, for example, and so on. And rock and roll, and the subcultures around rock and roll were affecting society. So you had the feeling that you could have your own special culture. You could be the metal guy or something, or whatever it was. And so all this was very liberating, and some of that crept into science fiction at the time. So there were books published that probably would never be published now. I mean, if you had PKD coming now, and even if he was using contemporary reference and technology, I'm not even sure he would get published. So it was more open then, despite all the formulas, and now it is more formulaic, in my opinion, except for there are some very good people working it. This guy Jemison you mentioned is supposed to be very good, I'm told.
Jemison's a lady.
Huh?
MK Jemison's a woman. So.
Oh, sorry. For some stupid reason, I thought he was male. She was male. These things are whirling about now. Gender. No one has a gender.
Larry, you have your hand raised first.
Yeah, John, like I said, I've followed you for decades now. And I've been really fascinated how in the last few years you've gone off on your Western slant. And I know, like, what was it, like 10 years ago or so, you did Wyatt in Wichita. So I knew there was that. And then all of a sudden, you've got your Cleve True books and all those these last few years.
Yes,
What brought
the
you to
Cleve True
that?
trilogy.
Yeah.
I did, yeah. Well, one of my escapist things when I was a kid was all the westerns on television.
Sure.
And certain movies that I saw, like the John Ford movies, Anthony Mann movies. These were actually really good movies and still stand up today. The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, and all these great movies. We saw them on Saturday afternoon, and they were kind of Americana Greek tragedies in a way, or Americana Homeric stories in a way, but without the gods or the fantastic in them. And I just never lost that inner little kid who wanted to be in the West and facing mortality every day, and I didn't really learn much about the actual nature of the West until later, and so I modified my opinion of it, of course, but it really had a big effect on me, and I started reading about Native Americans when I was a young man, and a teenager. Black Elk Speaks and so on, and Native American spirituality affected me too. So I always had that going, and I wanted to write a Western, and only in recent years have I found ways to do it. And now actually they're sending me royalties for these books, and I think they're going to reprint them, and they seem to be successful. But see, what I did was I created a kind of blend of Larry McMurtry and Louis L'Amour or something. I took these archetypal heroes from John Ford movies and tried to bring more humanity to them.
There's a sense of
sort of like the
them.
TV show Deadwood.
Yeah, there's a sense of justice in these novels.
I tried to bring more historicity, and in fact, I became a member of the Western Historians Association. I wrote articles about this stuff. I'm going to get a cough drop, and so these books were trying to take the revelations about how dark it was then, how much bigotry there was, and then bring that together with the idea of that there's still a heroic element in the West. There was still a heroic element, and there were good people then, and so they're confronting these dark social realities, but they're doing it as Art Cleve True is a gunfighter who used to be a hero of the Union Army in the Civil War. But see, he meets the distinct thing I want to mention about this. He falls in love with a woman who is a natural philosopher, and that's what they called scientists in those days, basically. The term wasn't used much then, but she is a very educated woman, really into the sciences as they existed at the time, and there was more than you think. And so here you have this guy who's a real rugged frontier character, well educated. He went to West Point and everything, but he's literary, but really comes from a pretty rugged scene. And she was a Boston lady who came out west with her mining magnate father, and essentially they run off together. But so then he's with her for all 3 books, and eventually they get married and they have a child, and the child almost dies of something, and together they explore all these dark sides of the West, but try and bring something of the better part of the American, myth to it, and make you believe that even in these, in this kind of total anarchically dark periods, people can make a difference and stand up for those who are weak and being oppressed. And I was uncertain if I could sell this to a conventional publisher of Westerns, but Kensington did it, Kensington Pinnacle. And the editor there was this woman who was just in love with the concept of it. She said, I don't know how they're going to sell. Even though there are a number of gunfights in it, it's still not the conventional Western. But it turns out there was a hunger for it.
Cam.
So a scientist in the Old West, and I made her, and it's not science fiction in the Old West, but it's the science that they had then.
It's interesting that later in your career you came to Westerns, just like another writer known for his horror and science fiction years ago, Richard Matheson.
Richard Matheson, who is one of my heroes. I studied writing under him in a way. I have different styles of writing, and some is more kind of richer and thick, and some is more austere. And my austere style is heavily influenced by Richard Matheson. And his shock stories and his novels.
Absolutely, yeah.
And his son, Richard Christian Matheson, is a good friend of mine, and also a well-known horror writer and television writer. And he wrote all kinds of horror, science fiction, television, and he wrote the introduction to my most recent story collection, The Feverish Stars. And so I'm like, I didn't get to meet Matheson, but I was his fan, and I'm a fan of his Twilight Zone work and so on. And yes, I read his Journal of the Gunfighter Years.
Yeah, that's a great book. That's a great book.
Great Western,
yeah.
But very, very realistic.
Yes.
I think it may
one
have
difference is
influenced
that Matheson wrote
B.
his
Parker.
Westerns early. He wrote his Westerns early in his career.
No, that's not correct.
No,
his
Matheson
novel
wrote
Western. No, I'm very sure. I've got them all. He wrote.
Well, I do too, but
he wrote a few short stories. The novels came out. The novels came out in the 90s.
Yeah, but I think he wrote Shadow of the Sun in the 70s. It just didn't come out till later.
Well, that's one of them. So that
was it a weird Western or was it a?
That was a weird Western.
That doesn't count, man. Don't tell me that weird Westerns are actually Westerns. They can be good. I have a weird Western story in The Feverish Stars, but those are not real Westerns, man.
Yeah. Cam, we need to move on to some other questions. Please. But Cam.
Hey John, I was just curious. Earlier you mentioned you briefly lived in Mississippi. I'm a Mississippi native. What part do you live in?
Near Gulfport.
Oh, okay, coast. Cool.
It was on the coast. We would go out to the beach along the Gulf, and I was a kid, 10-year-old kid, and I would dig down in the sand, and after about 6 inches or 8 inches, it would be like a layer of oil. That at least where I was there, because there had been spills, and they just covered them over.
Right.
That was kind of a revelation to me. It was pure oil in sand that was from spills. And it made me think about, the industrialization and its relationship to nature. For the first time, I really started thinking about it. But I loved the kind of atmosphere of the air in Mississippi. In southern Mississippi, it was like the air was thick. You could just reach out and grab it and squeeze it in your hand almost, And storms there were so dramatic.
I call it living in a soup. Whenever I travel out of the South, it's like I leave this bubble of humidity, and I'm like, oh, we've left the soup.
Yeah,
And
it's
now we're in
true.
this
It's true. It is true. But I kind of liked it. I just felt so alive there. It felt like it just seemed to be encouraging all this kind of rainforest thing happening in the woods near where we lived. And I loved it was very exotic to me who'd grown up till then mostly in Oregon. Yeah. So, and then I had my very educational encounters with the redneck kids at school, because I had become uh, somewhat radicalized by that time through my sisters, and so I refused to stand for uh, the Pledge of Allegiance when we all met together in the auditorium. I was the only one who wouldn't do it, and then I muttered something about Vietnam, and they kicked the shit out of me up in the bleachers.
Damn.
Meg, you have a question.
Thank you.
Yeah, John. Pleasure to talk with you. Get a chance to speak.
Oh, what, Nick? Meg had her hand
Oh,
up.
sorry,
Oh,
John.
Meg.
I'm sorry, David. I misunderstood what you said.
Yes.
There's Meg.
Hello. So thank you for being here. And I want to say I first read you as a horror writer. So you sort of answered this question in talking about Matheson. But I'm interested in how for you there's genre overlap between horror and science fiction, or do you think of those as separate genres? I mean, I think of somebody like Ellison. It's hard to draw the line in a lot of his work.
Yes, it is like that. I did read a lot of Ellison. Ellison was my hero when I was like 17, 18, 19. And that's all described, and strange things that happened between me and him after that in the Boonfark article. And I had written some horror before then, but mostly I had been concentrating on science fiction because it just it captivated me. And I also felt that I was pretty good at predicting things. And I did successfully predict, like in City Kamawaka, I predicted ATM machines and the change over to muchly anyway to electronic transfer of cash and all the ramifications of that. And there were a lot of things I predicted.
Neoconservatism.
So I thought I was pretty good at it. And I wanted to stay there, but then I made some enemies, and I left it for a while to focus on horror, because I discovered the horror publishers and editors didn't care about I don't care about my bad reputation. You know that song? They didn't care about it either. And so I was able to publish again in horror. And I always had loved horror too. When I was a little kid, I was a big fan of Tod Browning's Dracula with Lugosi. And I tried to dress like him. I tried to get my mom to make my hair like him. I was cosplaying as Dracula as like a 9-year-old boy. And this didn't go over well in school. I said things to other kids like, listen, the children of the night, what beautiful music they make. And I was like 9 years old, and they're going, taking a step back, so yeah, I had that in me, and I found that I was able to publish quite a bit of horror pretty easily. I published a number of novels that are still respected and I'm told that they were inspirational, amongst other things, amongst the work of other people, to splatterpunk, so-called.
Yeah, Sellers and In
Darkness Waiting.
In Darkness Waiting are two early ones that I think are really great. But of course, I consider Wet Bones to be my favorite horror novel ever written. So.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah. And then, Nick, did you have a question?
Yes, Eggs. I apologize again to Meg. I just misheard what David said. John, I remember carrying around a paperback copy of Eclipse with me when I was going to school, and I wanted to ask you, what's your relationship to music, especially as it relates to your writing? Because in so many of your books, music plays such a central role.
Yeah, it is a big influence on me. It's important to me. I play music while I'm writing. That's the drug I use instead of speed or something. I put on rock. I put on Stravinsky sometimes, for example. For certain other kinds of things, I might put on free jazz, but mostly hard rock, Blue Oyster Cult, and other bands like that. Stephen King does that quite a bit. But also I just, identify with the shamanism of being a rock performer and writing lyrics. I've written 25 songs recorded by the Blue Oyster Cult, the lyrics, and and just countless lyrics for myself and other people. And it's hard to describe, but it's visceral in me. It was very much connected to my libido. And when you're a young writer, your libido is always kind of hammering at you sometime. So that was an outlet for it. And I'll tell you, when it comes to whether I'm involved in music or writing a different genre of fiction, whether it's horror, science fiction, a thriller. I've written some thrillers. I try to make it my own, and Poppy Bright said that I was sui generis, without genre, and that I always made even a lot of my fiction. Like if you look at the book that won this Bram Stoker Award, Black Butterflies, A Flock on the Dark Side. The stories in it are some of them are science fiction, but very, very dark, almost supernatural feeling of science fiction. And some of them are supernatural horror in some wise. I just made, and it didn't seem to matter. I just made it all my own genre. And then with music, I brought all that into music and tried to make it work in rock. And I had some great opportunities and played some great gigs. And I played hundreds of gigs in rock clubs in New York and Europe and various places. I opened for the Blue Oyster Cult at the Roseland, is my favorite one because I'm a fan of theirs. And we had 2,000 people there, and that was in Portland. Right before the pandemic, and it was great, man.
That was with your most recent band, the Screaming Geezers.
The Screaming Geezers. Well, yeah, that was my most recent band. I think we're finally done with it, but we put out some albums and a couple of albums, and it's and we was called that because we're all older rockers. So I was always the lead singer, but my guitar player Jimmy Haskett was in early Portland punk rock, and then in Portland alternative rock continuously. Very super skillful guy. Is not any amateur garage player or something. He's being able to work with people like that, really skilled people, really, really good musicians. I worked with a bunch of them, and I just had that. To me, it was like a huge honor that they would play music, working with my lyrics and my singing. And so every time I was playing, it was a transcendent experience for me. I became a different person on stage. I related to that shamanism, and that the sense that you're creating a whole that is more than the sum of the parts in a rock concert. You must have, those of you who like rock and even jazz, you must have experienced this in concerts, where you feel that there is a group mind of some kind. And it's more than just suggestion or social cues.
Yeah, I think that's awesome, John. So does anybody else have any questions for John for the official part of the recording? Now, John, you can hang around if you want to for the second half of the Hangout. But
what's the second half about?
We just hang out and talk.
Well, let's hang out for a little bit, but I've got to go and have dinner here pretty soon. But
Sure.
If anybody has any other questions, or you can ask me also about other people in the science fiction field I might have known, or anything, really.
Yeah, well, I definitely want to hear just a little bit more about the Clarion experience, because I think
it was, I took acid there at Clarion, and this is a writer's
I think everyone
workshop.
wants to hear that story.
It wasn't such a good idea. It was only one day, but it was a workshop with all these big shots, Frank Herbert, and creator of Dune, and Harlan Ellison, and Ursula Le Guin. They each had their own week teaching us. Robert Silverberg and
excuse me, John, what year were you in? 72, 73?
That's a good question. Let's see. When was I 19? I believe it was 72. And Vonda McIntyre was there. If you know her work, and there were various other people like the guy who wrote Full Metal Jacket, Gus Hasford. He wrote the novel that was inspired the movie Full Metal Jacket, and it was later re-released under that name. He was there, and I read his first manuscript of it, for example. So I got to be there for the kind of seed of a Stanley Kubrick movie. And so when Ellison came, I don't know why, because he was my hero. Maybe because I was kind of scared of meeting my hero, and but I took acid, and then I heard, well, where is he, man? Where is he? And he's coming across the quad there. He's walking through those trees. I saw him way at the other side of the thing, and I went over and kind of snuck up in a tree and jumped on him on his back from a branch in the tree as he was walking by beneath me. And fortunately, I only kind of hit him glancingly. I mean, I don't know what I thought I was doing at all. I was just I thought he would think it was fun or something. I was so stoned. But I jumped on him, and he leapt out of the way and said, "What the fuck? What the fuck is this?" And and I said, "I'm John. I'm one of your students. I'm just saying hi." And he said, "You don't fucking jump on me to say hi, you fucking lunatic." And it was like that for a little while. For about half an hour, he would say things like that to me. And then the other people said, he is actually a really strange young man, but he is very talented, and he admires you so much. He's your biggest fan. And then he heard, "Oh, he's my biggest fan." And then suddenly he said, "Well, I'll let it go." And then he became a kind of sponsor for me after a while, kind of mentor for me for I don't know, a year and a half, 2 years, 3 years.
So note to self, young writers, jump out of trees on your favorite writers.
Well, yes, I don't recommend it.
Blake,
I could have really injured him, and so I could have ended up in jail for one thing, and he could have ended in the hospital. So, but I was also a kind of a wild man in those days, and and I struggled with that side of me for a long time. It was a sort of way to get over I had PTSD from some things that had happened to me as a child and as a teenager. And I kind of like, instead of shrinking into myself, I fought it by just going wild sometimes. And being his freakish character and trying to kind of recreate myself all the time. So that's what I was like at Clarion. But I can tell you that Ursula Le Guin was really nice to me. She was really patient. She loved the short story I wrote, and it got published in the Clarion anthology. And I had read something by her. It was The Left Hand of Darkness, and I was pretty awed by her. And then Robert Silverberg was kind of he was very skeptical about me, but at the same time he watched me with a certain fascination, I think, and he ended up publishing a bunch of stories by me in his anthologies. And I, at any writer's workshop, when you're really young, you have to be willing to walk over the coals with your bare feet.
Yeah,
because
Silverberg also
they are gonna excoriate you as when your amateurishness. I was always able to.
as well.
I knew a lot about writing already because I had just immersed myself in it, and I do have a gift for picking up styles of writing. I can write as different people. Like when I wrote, I completed a fragment by Edgar Allan Poe once. It was published in an anthology, and the critics remarked that it was seamless because I can do that. I can pick those things up, and so that was recognized. But also, I was still, screwing up like any 19-year-old writer would, and people they'll just say, "Grow up, kid, get over it." And that's what Ellison was always like. Ellison was always like, "Don't be a baby. Take the criticism. Suck it up. This is hard work being a writer. God damn it." And so
definitely sounds like
you got used to that kind of thing. You got to be a very thick hide about it. It's a very useful, and you sort of develop that voice in your own head. It becomes like a little sub persona of you as you to turn it to your writing.
Blake, did you still have a question?
Or is he exhausted by these rants?
Yeah. Sorry about that.
Oh, no problem at all. John, wonderful to see and hear you. My question for you is about the terminology or the taxonomy of cyberpunk itself. So growing up, I'm 58, born in 1966, and growing up in the late 70s, early 80s, the word punk meant, a certain kind of rock and roll. And it may have had other meanings. Yeah. So, pardon me?
It was and wasn't.
Yeah. Okay, good. So that might actually give me a little hint to where you might be going here. But at least to me, you had punk bands, and they were the Ramones, and they were getting into the early 80s in California, where I grew up, the Dead Kennedys, Black Flag. These were really aggressive live punk bands. And they had an independent ethos about how they put out records, and they're influenced by the MC5, maybe the Velvet Underground, the Dolls.
The Stooges.
Oh, absolutely.
And the Ramones.
So you end up with, this idea of what it meant to be, a punk rocker. And we all thought we were punk rockers. The last thing on our minds was the cyber part of cyberpunk. So computers, virtual realities would have been nothing that we would have ever thought of, to the extent that I don't directly remember, but vaguely remember when Blade Runner came out, and maybe the words were coming out about cyberpunk, and maybe even some of your novels. Nobody in the group the social scene that I was in would have been interested in the cyber aspect of punk. And I think the first novel that I read, which was supposedly cyberpunk, was Gibson's, of course, Neuromancer, which, everybody, if you were anybody when you were 18 and 85 like me, you read it.
Do you know who he dedicated the book to?
Was it you?
Me and Rudy Rucker.
Oh, okay. Well, good.
No, me and Bruce Sterling. Sorry.
Well, Well, for me, coming out of that era, the cyber aspect of punk was really kind of hard to comprehend. And even the novel itself, and then kind of catching up with your work and some other works, I've often just wondered about the term and thought, well, it seems like something that's kind of neat
Well, I'll tell you about it.
In terms of marketing.
Well, nobody thought of it that way, though. They do now, but we didn't. There's a famous expression. I'm not sure. I think it was Gibson who said it. The street has its own uses for technology, something like that. And so it was the same with rock and roll, and that is people living in a demi-monde and in a people living right on the edge of the fringe of society, and sometimes drug dealing, and sometimes some in prostitution, and a lot of my friends were prostitutes and strippers and hustlers, and so then it got to there, and a lot of the early people who were involved in nascent IT and the nascent cyber culture. Well, like the Mondo 2000 people, for example, very edgy people. I can tell you, man, they were all on drugs. I mean, literally, they were all on drugs. They interviewed me in Mondo 2000. I got to know them really well, and I'm telling you, there were some wild fucking people in that scene. Can't tell you that story. But so while they weren't thinking, like punks per se, they were thinking of being part of the underground culture. You think about underground kind of and semi-underground writers from the early 20th century and the beat era and so on. Those guys were pretty fucking edgy. William Burroughs, of course, but even before then. And so they identified with that stuff, and they wanted to use cybernetic stuff for subversion. They wanted to use it for radical purposes. They wanted to use it to subvert all these, entrapping modalities, and to empower people who weren't empowered. And to some extent, that has worked. You have people who have lives on the internet and made some success at them who could not have made it anyplace else. So there has been some empowering. There's also been empowered evil people, as you know. I mean, Trump is probably president because of the internet, in my opinion. It's the one uniting factor of all the disinformation, not just because of the internet, but how people used it. It's a two-edged sword, and all technology is a two-edged sword. So you see so that reminds you of the dark side of technology, and from that, people think about how will people on the street use technology to overcome things in cyberspace to their advantage, and Gibson characters were often people doing that. he modeled one after me, but I won't say which one.
Okay, so last question to Cam for John, and then we'll close out the interview and then do the rest of the hangout. I'm sorry we went a little bit long, but we don't every day have John Shirley with us. Cam, your last question.
Hi. I'm a big Trekkie. I was just wondering what it was like working on Deep Space Nine.
Well, I worked with Ira Bear, who's this great guy. He's the showrunner of Deep Space Nine. He was showrunner for lots of things, Outlander and all kinds of things on the Sci-Fi Channel and so on. But
Oh, did John freeze up? Oh, shoot. I think John.
Oh no.
Oh no. I know a little bit about this story. I do know that Ira was a fan of John's work from the cyberpunk era and invited him to write for Deep Space Nine. Just
Nice.
like he made Iggy Pop an alien on Deep Space Nine. So, oh shoot, looks like we lost John. John, are you back? Oh, okay. Well, yeah, Cam, that was a good question. I do know I've heard that story partially because I've talked to John a lot about it because I'm a big Deep Space Nine nerd as well, and I do know that he recruited John to write that episode. And by the way, that episode is very Dickian.
Right.
That episode of Deep Space Nine, because it's very what is reality involving O'Brien. So
Visions.
there is a what is reality twist to it. So it's actually very Dickian episode of Deep Space Nine. But on that note, all right, so I guess we'll close out the interview with John since we lost John anyways. But thank you everybody who came and asked questions for John. So back in the studio for the Dickheads, just remember to keep it paranoid, stay paranoid, and we'll be back next week with James Reich. We'll also have a cover reveal for my new novel, Great America in Dead World, next week as a part of the PKD Hangout. So thank you for joining us, David Gill. Yeah, paranoia is a skill. That's right. Oh, John, did you want to finish answering that question about Deep Space Nine?
Just that day, Ira Bear made it great because he was a fan of mine and he's this wonderful guy. And I got to be on the set, which is always not impressive at all to be on a TV set. I wrote for a lot of television, and it's never impressive to be there. It looks better on the screen, but I got to be there. I got to touch all the props. I got to hang out with Ferengis when and drink lattes with Ferengis in full makeup, and I got to write a script, and Ira helped me with that. So it was a beautiful thing, and I love Star Trek. I actually love it. I was affected by it a lot when I was 12 years old, and I did have I did send away for one of the little Vulcan science operator or science officer badges, one of so I could be like Spock, and I cut my hair like him for a few weeks. So
in the 60s you did this?
Yes, it was in the 60s. So that's how far my Star Trekkiness goes back. And so it was a thrill to be on Deep Space Nine. Now, what happened? We had a thing going, and then I vanished. Was it you? Was it me?
I think it was on your end, but
it was probably the spirits of propriety and common sense decided that I had been going on long enough.
So on that last note, John, do you want to tell people how they can find you and what you're working on now?
Well, this website, if you want to, you can the easiest way to email me, for example, is to go to the John Shirley website. If you just Google that, you'll find yourself there. It's John-Shirley.
And you can follow John on Blue Sky.
But there's a contact thing there, and I'm on Blue Sky and way too much, and you can talk to me there, and like all the information about all my work is, well, a lot of it anyway, most of it, and there's even a Wikipedia page that's mostly correct. So, and look for Boonfark. It's gonna make a noise. They're gonna review it in Locus and stuff.
And Ted White's in it. Who
Ted White, amongst other people from that generation, and from Dan Steffen's generation of old fan guys and professionals.
Gil, isn't he the one that Phil put his picture on the back of one of the editions of Man in the High Castle.
Alternate ending
Ted White,
We Can Build You that appeared in the serialized version, and then on the back of Man in the High Castle, I think he appears as Dick on the cover artist.
Yeah, because he was mad at Ted White for changing one of his stories. So as a joke, he used his photo for an author photo because he was mad that he had changed his story. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's the connection.
Ted White published some of my first short stories, some of my earliest.
Oh, that's
God bless him.
All right. So Larry, back in the studio, you can cut out this interview. Thanks for joining us.